Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome back to Compass Points, the weekly podcast about Knoxville news, government, politics, events, and anything else that gets our attention. I am Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass at CompassKnox.com, and I am joined, as always, by my fellow co-publisher, co-founder of Compass, Scott Barker. How are you doing, Scott?
Doing fine, Jesse. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. We are recording this on what is right now a beautiful fall Friday, which I'm really enjoying. It looks like things are going to get a little dicey through the rest of the weekend, so there's a couple of big festivals that have not yet happened on Saturday as we're recording this, and our best wishes to everybody involved in those. It's a nice weekend here.
So far, so good. We'll see how bad the rains get.
Yes,
and,
of course,
it's a lot better than things are in Florida and South Carolina.
Exactly, so, and that's what we're going to be seeing here is the remnants or extension, obviously, of Hurricane Ian. All of our best wishes to anybody impacted by that, of course. We did have nothing hurricane strength here locally, politically in the past week, but some interesting items that we will talk through. Our interview this week is with Jack Neely, a friend and old colleague of mine anyway. He's now the executive director of the Knoxville History Project, of course, formerly with Metropulse and the Knoxville Mercury, and we talked to him about one of the events that happened this week, which a dedication of a historic plaque for Adolph Ochs. We'll talk about that. We're going to hit on litter boxes. Why are we talking about litter boxes? Well, because the state legislature is talking about litter boxes. Why are they? We'll get to that in a minute. We had a major announcement, a business expansion in North Knoxville with some help from County Commission, Axle Logistics. We'll be talking about that. Another business also got a helping hand from County Commission this week, Martial Arts Academy on Maryville Pike. And to start us all off, we're going to go to sort of like the macro level. We had a major piece of legislation passed last year or I guess earlier this year.
Earlier this year, yes.
And it is starting to trickle down now, as these things do, to local impacts. And why don't you start us off, Scott, by talking about the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act, but probably the biggest impact. Obviously, inflation hasn't gone down since it was passed.
It's not so far reduced inflation.
Not yet. But it's real. One of its major impacts is going to be on the battle against global warming and climate change. There are a lot of environmental provisions in this bill, and I talked to a principal at Pershing Yoakley Associates. They only go by PYA now, but
major accounting firm,
accounting and consulting firm, and they analyzed the bill. And I talked to spokes of the city, Brian Blackman, the sustainability director, about what these impacts are primarily on the city's fairly ambitious emissions reductions goals. Those were, they wanted to reduce them by 50% over 2005 levels by 2030, They're 40% to the.
And when we say the city, because we need to differentiate, right? There's the city's goals, which have to do with city operations.
Right. That's on city operations. The more ambitious goal is by 2050 to reduce emissions over 2005 levels, community-wide.
Right. For all of us.
All of us, and that includes the private sector, includes the businesses, includes individuals, homeowners, that sort of thing. And this bill actually has a lot of provisions that will help on those. One of the things that that obviously directly affects city government and utilities the most is a provision that will help them put in solar arrays. One of the things is up until now, there were tax credits that businesses could get to install, and homeowners to install solar arrays at their place of business or their home, but governments couldn't do it because governments don't pay taxes,
right.
So they don't get tax credits. So what this bill does is it is going to have a provision where the Treasury Department will make direct payments to them that would be the equivalent of a tax credit. So they can go ahead and do that. So the city, the county could take advantage of it as well. The school system could put arrays on their properties and get this payment that would be the equivalent of a tax credit. They don't know exactly how it's going to work out yet. TVA and KUB are also very interested in this. The nuts and bolts about how it's going to be done haven't been decided yet. They're waiting for guidance on that. But it's a big deal for them. That should easily help the city make that 2030 goal. Mm-hmm. But there are also all kinds of provisions in there for businesses and individuals. One of the big ones is tax credits for upgrades to your home or upgrades to your business.
And these are like energy efficiency
upgrades, appliance upgrades. I mean, if you go out and buy a new refrigerator, an energy efficient refrigerator, you can get a tax credit for that once everything gets put into place. Businesses can get these, especially there are industries where they put in emissions controls. Carbon capture mechanisms in their smokestacks, and they will be able to get huge tax credits for that. And so one of the big challenges, though, is getting the word out about this. I was talking to Brian Blackman, the sustainability director for the city, and he was saying that they're already looking at ways to get the word out to residents, to small businesses especially, about what is available to them. It will help their bottom line. It helps your utility bills, and as Brian pointed out, it helps the world as well. So, so that was an interesting way to look. I thought to look at how federal regulations impact us locally.
Sure. Well, and I guess if we start to see solar panels and solar arrays kind of mushrooming around public or private property,
yes,
this bill may be part of them.
Right.
All right. Well, wanted to hit briefly on County Commission met this past Monday, and one of the things they voted on was an appeal of a denial of a rezoning request from the Knoxville Martial Arts Academy. This is something we talked about last month when it went through the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission had turned this down. Basically, the Knoxville Martial Arts Academy is a business that has been operating for 20 years, and they've been based in the Pease Furniture Building there in Vestal, right in the heart of South Knoxville. But they wanted a new space, a bigger space, a more modern space, and had bought some property on Maryville Pike, just outside city limits, hoping to rezone it from residential to commercial use. And it is an area of Maryville Pike that there's a lot of commercial use on already. Right. But the Planning Commission, partly because I think there's been so much discussion about the need for more housing, Planning Commission, planning staff had recommended let's keep it zoned for housing. That would be a better use of it. However, the Knoxville Martial Arts Academy has about 300 students who go there, and they teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and mixed martial arts and some other things. And they have sort of a whole community around them that really came out to support them. And at the county commission this week, there were a couple dozen people who came down there just to show their support for this. And nobody opposed it, which was probably the most important thing. Usually when somebody wants to rezone, especially residential property to commercial use, you'll hear concern. But in this case, because of where it is, there's really only one house that's anywhere close to them. They said they went and talked to them, and they were okay with their plans. And so county commission ended up reversing it. And so this happens sometimes. We talk about planning commission. Planning commission on zoning issues. There are certain decisions planning commission makes that are essentially final. They can be appealed, but not to county commission or city council. But zoning decisions basically always have to go through city council or county commission, depending on where it is. And sometimes they will reverse planning commission. And that's what they did in this case. It was a unanimous vote on commission, and all the commissioners basically said they admired this business and their kind of outreach to the local community and what they were bringing there. So there will be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu on Maryville Pike. They're planning to get started there, and I think probably make that move within the next year or so, because they've already bought a prefab metal building. They're ready to put it up. They just needed the rezoning first.
Yeah, one thing when that went before planning commission, one of the concerns the planning commissioners had is that there is a lot of commercial property in that stretch of Maryville Pike, but a lot of it's empty. And they were like, well, there's all this commercial. We don't need to rezone this to commercial because we've got plenty of unused commercial property right there. Of course, on the flip side, there's lots of commercial property down there, but none of that property is owned by the
Well, they
by
actually
the club.
They addressed that a little bit at the meeting. Their attorney Ben Mullins said, they did look at existing commercial property, and in fact, and we won't go into all the weeds of this, but they thought they were buying a piece of commercial property along with this that turned out to have a contested deed, and they couldn't get that. But he said they looked at the other commercial property, and either they weren't available or they weren't suitable to their needs and all of that. So anyway, that it's just an example of the way these processes can, decisions at one level are subject to review. And a lot of these things really are. People don't always believe that these things are decided on a case-by-case basis. But I think you and I have seen enough hundreds, if not thousands, of these rezonings to say that actually they really are.
They
you
sure
can't
are.
necessarily predict the outcome of any given case depending on what's happened in the past, because the details always matter. Okay, another vote also on County Commission's agenda this week was approving a pilot incentive, a payment in lieu of taxes, for a pretty sizable business expansion, and you wrote about that.
Yeah, the Axel Logistics, they're a third-party logistics firm that they hate using the term. They're basically a logistics broker. They take they find companies that need things shipped, hook them up with shipping companies, and work that out to try to make things run more smoothly. As we all know, the recent supply chain disruptions, they got lots of business because of that, because companies decided they needed somebody to come in and do basically emergency work on
like
for them.
I've got this shipping container over here, and I need it over here by next Tuesday. Somebody help me.
Yeah, please help. And they have, and they are growing tremendously. They've been on the Inc. 5000 list of fastest growing private companies for 7 consecutive years, which is a pretty impressive feat. Anyway, they have about 385 employees. Their headquarters is in North Knoxville near the National Cemetery.
In the historic Hull Dobbs building.
In the historic Hull Dobbs building, a former auto dealership there that they renovated using a pilot from the city of Knoxville. Well, this one will help them build a new building right across the side street off Central from their existing building. It'll be about 5 stories, $32 million investment. It's going to essentially create a campus for their company there. They'll have 2 buildings. They've already got a parking lot a little bit further back from those buildings. They're looking for more parking in the area because this is going to triple their workforce. Once they build it out and fill it with employees, they'll have about 1,200 employees
total between the
two buildings. It's a big project. One of the things that they're doing is they have they're really one of these tech companies that emphasizes doing good things for their employees. Providing amenities for the employees. I shouldn't say necessarily good things, but they have a gym. They've got a half-court basketball court where people can play. They've got outdoor putting green. They've got all kinds of they got pool tables and ping pong tables and all kinds of things for people to take breaks in. And when I was there, I was able to tour the existing facility. It's pretty fast-paced, pretty pretty interesting place to watch people work. And
when you and I were at the News Sentinel, we were happy if somebody just bought us a pizza once a year.
Yeah.
We didn't have any of this.
Election night pizza was the best we got, and that was great. Although I will say that in the newer building at the News Sentinel, they did have a gym that was I did not utilize it as often as I should have. Right. Anyway, but this company, these jobs are well-paying jobs. They are the average pay is about $117,000 a year, and so that one of the things that Mike Odom of the chamber said was that that really hits the demographic that they're trying to attract. One of the big points of emphasis for the chamber and for city and county governments is to attract and retain college-educated young professionals,
including people coming right out of the University of Tennessee.
People coming right out of the University of Tennessee. In fact, one of the programs that Axel has is they've got a deal with the Haslam College of Business where the College of Business has a sales lab, and they have students who will make sales calls for Axel Logistics, and as kind of an internship program, and the they won't get commissions off of it, but the equivalent of the commissions will go to the University of Tennessee. So,
and I do think that's one thing worth adding. A lot of these jobs, they will be high paid, but they are sales jobs. Not all of them, but a lot of what they're adding is sales capacity, because that's a lot of what they do is kind of constantly calling on potential clients and trying to make deals with people. And so I think some of the jobs, and they talked about this at commission, will have sort of a base salary of more like in the high 40,000s, but then with commissions anticipated to push them much higher.
Right. Yes. Another point that the political folks like to make is that this is a stretch of North Central Street that needs development, redevelopment. Once it was one of the vibrant corridors of the city, and went through a lot of years of where not much has gone on, has seen a lot of development, kind of incremental development over
parcel by parcel.
Yeah, Happy Holler has been redeveloped for the most part, and more projects are going on in down there. But this is corporate headquarters that's going in there, and it's Mayor Kincannon and Mayor Jacobs are both saying, that this is going to help spur more activity along that corridor.
Sure. Well, and I think that because the University of Tennessee has such a strong, we talked about this the other week, number 3 logistics program in the country. Right. Obviously, Axel Logistics, the guys who founded it, came out of that program, and they are very much building on that with their workforce. And it's kind of a fantasy project in a way, because this is one of these things that our local economic development people at the chamber and in the city and county have been talking about for years, is we need to kind of leverage the University of Tennessee to provide us with our new, young, educated workforce that will then bring in companies or spur entrepreneurs and so forth. Yeah,
and you mentioned the logistics program at UT being highly ranked. The marketing program is pretty highly ranked too, and as you said, a lot of these jobs are basically marketing and sales jobs. Yeah. So the marketing department, they're going to get a lot of talented people out of that, or they can. The the task, as it always has been getting these graduates to stay here and work in Knoxville.
Right. Okay. Well, from the, I guess not sublime exactly, but solidly good news, I guess you could say, to the ridiculous, litter boxes. So this has been a discussion for some months now, really much of the past year, not locally, but at the national level. There's been kind of this bubbling, mostly spread through social media, rumor out there that public schools are allowing students who identify as cats to use litter boxes rather than bathrooms. I'm just going to go ahead and say right now, this isn't true. There's zero evidence of this ever happening anywhere. Not a single case that anybody has ever produced showing that this has happened in one school or with one student. But the idea has spread across the whole country. And in fact, the earliest citation of it isn't even from the United States. It's from Canada, Prince Edward Island in October 2021. So this has been going on for like a year now. That was the first place where at least there was a media report of it. And what has happened in place after place is people have come to school board meetings and stood up and said, I hear that in our schools you're letting children who identify as cats use litter boxes. And so superintendent after superintendent across the country has had to debunk this and come out and say this is not true. And, it's not exactly a mystery where the idea comes from.
Yeah.
It's an outgrowth of the discussion about transgender students in schools and what the very real and serious discussion about the degree to which public schools provide recognition and accommodation to transgender students. And we've talked about that before too, and that's been a big issue in our own state legislature, for example. But so this is kind of one of those urban myths that builds up alongside kind of bubbling political talk and discontent and so forth.
Well, one thing about this too is it basically mocks transgender,
exactly,
the transgender community, and it's whenever I hear these things too, it's kind of like it's it's not true, and it's kind of silly, but there's also a tinge of meanness to it, the whole mockery of those of those decisions that people make.
Right.
So.
The people who are weird and we don't like or we feel uncomfortable with, it's a way of kind of mocking, trivializing, and it's very similar. We saw this for years, obviously, with the gay and lesbian community, where when we talked about same-sex marriage, for example, marriage rights, people would come out and say, well, people are going to be marrying their dogs. I mean, associating people with animals is a, very common and maybe rhetorically effective way of kind of marginalizing them, demonizing them, ridiculing them. So yes, I agree. I think that's the root of it. And so this past week, it finally bubbled up and landed in the Tennessee legislature. And there was a joint subcommittee hearing where they were talking about charter schools, or they were supposed to be talking about charter schools. But we had both a state representative, Mary Littleton, and then a state senator, Janice Bowling, neither of them from Knox County, I guess we can say that at least, who went on for some minutes asking questions to the head of the state charter school commission about whether charter schools allowed furries, people identifying as animals, to use litter boxes in school. And both Representative Littleton and Senator Bowling, just asserted that, well, we know this is a problem. Representative Littleton said, we know this is a problem across the state. Senator Bowling said that she said in her own district, her own rural district in Tullahoma, that, not only were students being allowed to use litter boxes, that it was happening in the hallway. And, one of the interesting things, Tess Stovall, who was responding to these questions from the state charter school commission, just kind of said, well, no, ma'am, we don't have that in charter schools. But she did not say, and nobody, at least in the portion of the meeting that I watched, said, this is absurd. And, let's just be honest. Like, we're reporters, we're objective. This is objectively absurd. And you think about a state legislator sitting there making these allegations in public about her own school system. Yeah. And you think, well, have you talked to your own school system? And like, you think about the logistics of it. Like, what are you imagining? Clearly, like, let's say this was something that happened. Well, it's not going to be litter boxes. Litter boxes are for cats. They're small. Yeah. No child is going to be able to use a litter box if they wanted to. So you'd have to imagine that somebody out there is building child-sized litter boxes, like sandboxes or something, that then they are putting in school bathrooms or in hallways. Well, I mean, think about anything that you have to put into a school building. It has to be ADA accessible, and never mind like the basic health concerns that would arise from anybody using a litter box. And, so you think this is the kind of thing that 30 seconds at most of thinking about how likely this might be would be enough to dissuade you. And then maybe you would at least call your local school system or go visit your local schools to see it before you go and say it at a hearing of the governing body for the entire state. So all that said, this having been raised, and this issue has been kicking around for a while. I've seen it raised on parent, Facebook parent forums here in Knox County, but never at a level where it felt like we needed to debunk it. But when we have actual elected state officials saying it, I did call or emailed Knox County Schools and said, can you verify for me whether or not you have any students using litter boxes in your schools? And Carly Harrington, the communications officer for the school system, wrote back and said, no, we, to our knowledge, we do not have any litter boxes in our schools. So if anybody hears this, if you have an uncle who's sharing it on Facebook, or you have a state legislator or other public official who's saying it in any capacity anywhere, feel free to tell them that it's not true and send them to us if they have any questions. There's also an entire Wikipedia page about this exact phenomenon that has links to reports from school systems literally across the country where this has come up. So it's very easy to look up and debunk. And as always with such things, we wish that more people would take the time to do that.
One thing is the diligent reporting that you did on this.
Yeah.
Is the type of diligent reporting that was celebrated in Knoxville.
That's correct.
Over the
Good
past couple of
segue.
days. Yes.
Yes, this is exactly the kind of thing that Adolph Ochs would have had his reporters get out there and debunk very quickly. So we have an interview coming up with Jack Neely.
Right.
But why don't you go ahead and set it up for us? Tell us about why we're talking about Adolph Ochs.
Well, Ochs was the most influential publisher in American newspaper history. He took the New York Times when it was struggling, about to go completely bankrupt, and built it into the most influential and important newspaper in the United States. And he actually got his start, learned how to the newspaper business here in Knoxville. He was the son of German Jewish immigrants. They moved here after the Civil War. He started working at the Chronicle at age 11. Age 17, he moved to Chattanooga, bought the Chattanooga Times, turned it into a strong newspaper, and then bought the New York Times and on into history. But his start was here. And so what locally, Georgiana Vines, she was a founding member of the East Tennessee Society of Professional Journalists, a colleague of mine and yours at the News Sentinel.
And I should mention that I'm on the board of the ETSPJ, so have been listening to Georgiana talk about this for some years as a project she really wanted to get done. And I think it's fantastic that she was finally able to pull all the pieces together.
Yeah, she spearheaded that. They've got what it is it's a plaque commemorating, recognizing Ochs's contributions and his time here in Knoxville. It was dedicated on Thursday at the it's on the Wall Avenue side of 36 Market Square, which is They don't think that was the building that the Chronicle was in. I think it was one or two down. They're not exactly sure which building the Chronicle was in.
Pretty close.
It's pretty close, and so Knoxville now has a place that honors a person who, basically grew up here and went on to become to make a huge mark in in world affairs.
Sure.
One thing that a lot of people may not realize is that there would be no Times Square New Year's Eve ball drop had it not been for Adolph Ochs,
Right.
who was the one who started first with fireworks and then switched over to ball drop in 1904. And so anyway, so there was also a panel discussion about Ochs's life here in Knoxville and other things. Jack Neely, who's our guest, was a member of that panel, along with Alex Jones, who was Alex S. Jones. Not Alex
Right,
Jones.
not that Alex
Not
Jones.
that Alex Jones, but this Alex Jones he's a native of Greenville. His family ran the Greenville Sun for forever and ever and ever. And he and his late wife, Susan Tift, wrote one of these seminal books on the Ochs family and their influence in American life. So anyway, we went to the unveiling. We went to the panel discussion. We have a story about that. It's out from behind our paywall, so anybody can go there and read it. And then we also talked to Jack in this interview.
Yeah, so we talked to Jack about Adolph Ochs and about the Knoxville History Project and all the work that they do. So let's go to the tape. So our guest this week on the podcast is Jack Neely, who is the executive director of the Knoxville History Project. He's also an old friend and colleague of mine. Jack and I worked at Metropulse for several years together, and at one point even shared an office. And my memory of that,
That's right.
We had sort of a contest to see who could be the last one to clean up their desk. Our desks kind of poured over with books and notebooks and newspapers and spread across the floor, but somehow we managed to keep getting things done. So Jack, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you, Jesse. I think I won that contest because you should see my desk right now. It's got even more stuff on it than I had back then, but it's all sort of organized.
Well, because you don't have Joe Sullivan or anybody stopping by periodically to frown at the mess, right?
Yeah, I'm kind of proud of it now. When TV crews come in here, I always like to talk here, and they seem to like it too.
Sure. Well, we want to talk about the events that happened this week commemorating Adolph Ochs in Knoxville. But before we get to that, I think a lot of people in Knoxville certainly know you from years at Metropulse and Secret History and so forth, and the Knoxville Mercury. Tell us about the Knoxville History Project, what you're doing now, and what you all work on.
We're a small nonprofit based on the history and culture of the city of Knoxville. It's surprising that Knoxville's always been the headquarters of the East Tennessee Historical Society, which is a great organization, but it's a 35 county organization, and we're just about the city of Knoxville, which has its own history that's distinct, or of course related to Appalachia and East Tennessee in many ways, but also distinct in its own way. And we try to tell Knoxville stories to people who don't know that Knoxville has a different ethnic mix, a different economic mix, and all these has its own history that's distinct in many ways, and that's what we concentrate on. But we do all sorts of things. We publish books. That's probably what we're best known for. Historic Knoxville: The Curious Visitor's Guide is our flagship book, which came out a few years ago. We sold several thousand copies of that. More recently, we've published Historic Bearden and Downtown Knoxville just this year, which is a mostly photographic book. And just brand new is our literary guide. This is something
I just saw that literary guide. It's very cool. Yeah, tell us about that.
For a long time. Yeah, it's I'm glad to finally get this out, and I'm looking for a copy on my message desk. I would love to show it off. I'm really especially proud of the cover of it. Oh, here it is, right here. And I wonder how many people can recognize that that particular gargoyle who's reading a book somewhere downtown. I'll let people puzzle about that, but it's basically a guide to everything literary in Knoxville history, especially the writers who have some national currency, who had some connection to Knoxville. And we have, of course, the obvious, James Agee, Nikki Giovanni, Cormac McCarthy, these people who grew up in Knoxville and wrote about Knoxville, but also some kind of surprising connections to Tennessee Williams and Carl Sandburg and Kurt Vonnegut and people like that people may not know had any association with Knoxville. But it's not exactly a tour, but it's you can use it as a walking tour. It's got a lot of places that were either associated with the people or what they wrote about, and we have in many cases excerpts of them of McCarthy or Agee especially writing about spots in downtown Knoxville, and you can see how they've changed or not changed in some cases. But we're proud to get this out. This was done with a grant, so it's absolutely free. We have thousands of copies, and people can pick them up at the library, at the History Center, at Union Avenue Books, other places, or here. We've got them here too. So at the History Project up here on Gallows Hill. So we have an office here and kind of keep semi-regular hours every day here downtown. But yeah, we're pretty tickled with that, and we're working on other things coming up. We're planning a big book about South Knoxville over the next year and a half, probably. So, we're working all the time. Just finished a book about the Centennial of United Way, a big book about that whole story since 1922, and also a book about the coal fields of the kind of north and west parts of the region, and how that's influenced Knoxville's history in many ways, from the strikes to the convict labor controversy to the explosions and all the things. We've heard a lot of these stories discreetly, but this story written by Paul Brown, not by me, but we have got an associate to write this, kind of tells the whole story as one 150, 60 year story about the history of coal in East Tennessee, and it's more interesting than you might assume. It's
I think a lot of people, certainly people who have moved to Knoxville maybe in recent decades, don't have much sense of the importance of coal at a certain point to East Tennessee. They think coal as being more a Kentucky or East or West Virginia.
We had dirtier coal than they did, but it was profitable coal for many years, and that was why J.P. Morgan, all these big major New York figures and Ohio people came down here to mine and sell our coal. But it like it or not, it did have a big impact on our economy and even on our art and politics and other things. It's interesting, like Catherine Wiley was born in Coal Creek, and our impressionist artist has actually spent her life trying to create a world away from coal, in a way, just the beautiful green settings of her well-known pictures of mothers and children. But also E.T. Sanford, our only Supreme Court justice, was connected. His family was here because of the coal business, and so it's there's a whole lot to it. But Knoxville History Project, we do all sorts of things. You might have noticed the art wraps around downtown. We have 30 of those so far downtown, and we're going up Magnolia now with some newer ones. And everywhere there's a spare traffic box with graffiti on it or whatever, we put some local art on it, and with a little story about the artist who created it. So that's been a success. And but we do talks and tours, and we occasionally try to do a podcast or something like that here and there. But we have a great website, knoxvillehistoryproject.org, and I dare anybody to be able to read everything on there in less than a week or so. It's there's a lot of stuff there.
Absolutely, a great resource.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. But that's why I mean, it's the story of Adolph Ochs has always been one of the most interesting stories, and I've sometimes have said this is how I got involved in this, because I worked for 35 years ago. It's hard to believe. 35 years ago, I worked for Whittle Communications, and a lot of people who came to work for Whittle came here out of journalism school and knew more about journalism history than I did. In many cases, they were from New York or Chicago or St. Louis or somewhere else, and they came here and were curious about this plaque on Gay Street, and this is a plaque most people don't notice today, but it's up now on the side of Plaza Tower, but it's a plaque about Staub's Opera House, which was built there in 1872. And it says that in his youth, Adolph Ochs was an usher at Staub's Opera House. And a lot of people read that and thought, well, gosh, what was he here on summer vacation or something from New York, or why was he here? And the fact it doesn't have room on the plaque to tell you that he lived here. And in fact, he spent most of his youth here, had all of his formal education in Knoxville, and began his career in journalism here.
And for people who don't know, just to jump in, but Adolph Ochs was not the founding publisher of the New York Times, but he took over the paper in the late 1800s and really built it into the kind of journalistic powerhouse that it still is. And I think it's his great-great-grandson who is still the publisher today. So a huge figure in American journalism.
Yeah, he really did create. He was not the original founder of the New York Times, but he bought the New York Times had a circulation of 9,000 when he bought it in 1896, and he really built it into the paper we know today. It introduced a lot of the things familiar to the paper, like the book review and the magazine, and also the motto, of course, all the news is fit to print. That's all Adolph Ochs, and that's why his name is still number one on the masthead today. He was the most influential publisher of the New York Times. Sir.
Yeah, one of the things about him that was I think people don't realize today, or a lot of people who aren't involved in journalism, is that when he took over the New York Times, it was yellow journalism era.
Yeah.
And papers were openly partisan, and they mix in a lot of editorial content and news stories and all. And he actually changed that, not only for the New York Times, but for newspaper journalism all across the country, because that became the model for papers all from coast to coast.
That's definitely my impression too. And in fact, most 19th century papers were Republican or Democratic or Whig or whatever here in Knoxville and also in New York. And they didn't make any pretense of objectivity. It was they represented their side for their partisans, and I'm afraid that we may be getting back to that now. That's one of the creepy things about this moment about 2022. It seems like we're kind of slipping back into the 19th century way of thinking about journalism. And we may remember this period that Adolph Ochs helped kick off as kind of a golden era of journalism. But he had this idea that you had to be fair. You had to talk to everybody. You had to be sure you're right before you put it in print. And that was part of his motto. All the news that's fit to print, and really making it fit to print was the key. By the way, his cousins, the Bloffelds in Knoxville, always claim that he stole their cigar store motto. That they had a cigar store on Gay Street that said that all the cigars that are fit to smoke is what they claim.
I love it.
But they, I don't know how. I've tried to prove that that's true, but I haven't disproven it yet. But
it's a good story. Well,
yeah.
So we're recording this on Tuesday this week, and so these events that are happening haven't yet happened, although they will have happened, barring catastrophe, by the time this airs. So there's going to be, or there is a plaque that's going on Wall Avenue, kind of on the side of that building at the end of Market Square there, which has been put together by the local Society of Professional Journalists and the national SPJ too, which I should say as an aside, I'm on the board of the local SPJ. I'm not getting paid anything to promote this. We're not a volunteer organization, but you work with these kinds of historic plaques a lot, Jack. And can you tell me, first of all, why do you think it's important for Knoxville to have a plaque honoring Adolph Ochs? And secondly, because we kind of went through this in developing this plaque, how important is it to get the facts on these plaques right?
Yeah. Well, I think plaques are often problematic. I think there are probably about a dozen plaques in Knoxville that I have take exception to in one way or another, either because they left something out, or there's something's confusing in it, or something's just wrong in it. But I'm glad that this plaque is absolutely accurate as far as I know. The importance, I think, is to remind Knoxville that we are, well, on that most elemental level, that we're connected to the world in ways that we often assume. We often assume that Tennessee is this remote place, different, distant from the world. But also in this particular case, the whole story of the Ochs family, I think, connects us to the even broader world than New York, because his parents were immigrants from Bavaria. They were Jewish immigrants from Bavaria, the refugees, basically. His mother had been threatened with arrest as a teenager, and that's why she came to America. His father, I think, just came for better circumstances, but that whole story of the Ochs is important to tell. But also to kind of plant a flag. The fact that the Ochses are connected to Chattanooga is pretty well known, and Chattanooga has plaques and statues and things about the Ochses, where they moved when Adolph Ochs was almost 20 years old and began. He took over the Chattanooga Times, and that's where he became famous as a newspaper man. But he really began his career here in Knoxville, and where he lived, and where like I say, where he got all of his formal education, where he learned the newspaper business. And he would tell the Knoxville story, and after dinner talks for the rest of his life about how he began doing all the jobs of a newspaper man on Market Square, working for Captain Rule's Knoxville Daily Chronicle was the paper. This is interesting because they would at the times in the early 20th century, they said that he was the publisher, and often publishers are aloof and don't really know what their employees are doing, but he was known to walk into the print room or whatever and be able to talk to these people who were typesetting and that sort of thing, and suggest ways to improve what they were doing, because he had done it himself. So he said this was his school of journalism, basically, was working for the Chronicle in the 1870s. And in fact, he started even before that as a paperboy in the 1860s, right after the Civil War. And I think Knoxville during this period was and his family in particular, was a crucible for a guy to value to objective journalism. It was a place, a fascinating, extremely complicated place. We often forget that the post-Civil War period had not just two sides. We had really three parties, that they're Democrats, the Republicans, and they're radical Republicans, and they were at each other's throat all the time. And this was a sometimes violent period, and a period when people had completely different ideas about the role of Black people in post-Civil War America, for one thing, and just the reconstruction of the city. Will the city even survive? Because the Civil War just knocked the wind out of it, and it was not until the 1870s that you see the city really start to pick up and become a dynamic urban place. But it was massive changes, and a lot of people who lived here were not native to Tennessee. They were from the north. They were from Connecticut or Massachusetts, but they were from the deep south. They were from Ireland. They were from Switzerland. They were from Germany, like the Ochses were. And so it was just an interesting mixture of people here together. And the idea of putting out a newspaper for all these people who have almost nothing in common, some of them just learning English, was a really interesting and important thing to be doing at that time. So to bind all these things together, but also his own family. I think his own family has such divisions in it. They were both Bavarian Jewish immigrants, his parents, but his mother had been more of a Democratic partisan during the revolutions of 1848 than his father had. His father was more sympathetic with the nobility, and his name had been Oxenhorn, that was his full name in Europe. He decided to drop it to Ochs when he came to America, but he never really gave up this sympathy with the princes who were the Habsburg or whatever princes who were trying to take care of things over there, the Hohenzollerns. I can't remember who all the people were involved, but his mother was an absolute Democratic partisan. And then when the Civil War came along, they split again. And his mother, who had some uncles who were cotton growers in Mississippi, was a Confederate sympathizer, and she had actually gotten in trouble for trying to smuggle quinine to Confederate troops out of Cincinnati when they lived in Cincinnati. At the same time, their husband was training Union troops. So this is a remarkable. We hear about brother versus brother, but this was husband versus wife. And I don't think either one of them ever budged much, but they loved each other anyway, and it somehow made it work. And this family, even within their family, they had these big conflicts. And the idea of a kid growing up in this family and knowing the importance of telling the truth and being able to back up what you're saying and not make anybody too mad became important to Adolph Ochs. So it was. I think this was part of his upbringing and into journalism. But anyway, that's yeah. What's that, Scott?
I was going to ask why did it take Knoxville so long to recognize Adolph Ochs in a formal way?
He doesn't fit into anybody's ideas of what Knoxville history is. He does connect to people like Parson Brownlow, who is a more complicated guy than we like to say. People just like to say he was the most hated governor in Tennessee history and let it in there. Ochs worked for William Rule, who had worked for Parson Brownlow. Parson Brownlow was a radical Republican after the war, had been a pro-slave Whig before the war, so he went through a really complicated change during the war. But we think of Knoxville as being a much simpler place than it was, and it doesn't really have a place for Bavarian Jewish refugees changing journalism here. That's something that really doesn't fit into the blue versus gray and all that. I've always found that thumbnail descriptions of Knoxville always have the brave pioneers, the Civil War, and then TVA, and that's basically there are whole eras, multiple eras between all these things that I think it was a cauldron of all these different ways of thinking. And in many ways, I think what happened between these periods were as influential or more on the modern world. That's one of the things we do at KHP is try to tell the whole stories between the wars, between the dramatic and kind of often simplified parts of our history.
Well, I very much appreciate your efforts, Jack. I always tell people that I'm part of the generation that learned about Knoxville from Jack Neely, because I moved to Knoxville in 1994 and you were already publishing Secret History. And so that was really my grounding in the complexity and also the colorfulness, the great characters and stories of all kinds. So I very much appreciate it. I wanted to mention, I worked at the New York Times for a little while, and I was originally working in the old New York Times building, which they moved out of while I was there. And going into that building, and I had just moved to New York from Knoxville, every day you passed a bust of Adolph Ochs sitting right there in the lobby. Yeah. And I knew the story of Ochs from you. And so it was just funny to me that I moved from Knoxville to New York and I end up working there. And I walked past the bust of this guy who knew Market Square as well as I did,
Yeah. And of course, Times Square was his creation. The original New York Times, Times Square, he created as a major focal place for Manhattan. And as a way to promote the New York Times by calling it Times Square instead of Longacre Square, when it's just like an intersection there. And he started the Times Square celebrations every New Year's Eve. He was Jewish and wanted a secular celebration that everybody could join in at the holidays. And that was when New Year's Eve became a big deal in 1904 or something like that, when beginning with fireworks, and then they banned his fireworks, and then he said, well, why don't we just drop a lighted ball? And back then that was an amazing thing to see. But that was but he had a big influence on our culture in lots of ways, other than even beyond journalism.
Sure.
without being very, and part of the problem was that he was not a really loud guy himself. He was a fairly personally conservative sort of guy who didn't really go around boasting. There aren't the outrageous stories about him that there are about Kaz Walker or Parson Brownlow or whatever. And that's another reason he's kind of not stood out very loudly in Knoxville history in the ways that we have remembered otherwise. But he was like a good journalist. He was an observer, I think, and was tried to figure out what other people are doing.
Great. Well, that's a good place to wrap up. But I'm, for one, very happy that Knoxville is now recognizing that legacy. And thanks for your part in that. And thanks for giving us a couple minutes. We appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Scott. We appreciate it.
Thanks again to Jack for talking with us. Always a pleasure. I don't know about you, Scott, but I feel like 90% of what I know about Knoxville, I feel like I learned from Jack Neely. Like over the years, just kind of his immersion in all things Knoxville, in every sort of era, in every corner of Knoxville life, and all of the kind of surprising ways that Knoxville connects to events and people like Adolph Ochs, who you wouldn't necessarily expect. I just feel like I'm, I need a diploma from the Jack Neely School of Local History. Or something.
Absolutely. And one of the things mentioned before the interview ran was we didn't know exactly where the Chronicle building was. Well, Jack is the one who said, told me that we don't know exactly where the Chronicle building was. Well, if Jack Neely doesn't know,
right,
nobody knows.
Right.
There's no way to find out because he has looked.
Yeah,
and
he knows how to look,
and he knows how to look. He knows where to look. He is a just walking library of Knoxville history.
Yep, so. Absolutely. So, looking ahead to next week, we do have a couple of things coming up. The school board will have its monthly workshop and voting meeting. The work session is on Monday. The regular meeting is on Wednesday. Both of those at 5 p.m. in their Summer Place boardroom. Not a super exciting or dramatic agenda. There is one interesting thing on it, which they talked about a bit at a 2-day annual work session they had this past week, which is how they are going to evaluate Superintendent John Ryswick, because, of course, he's only been in that position now for 5 months. And they need to decide. He needs to know, how's he going to be evaluated. His contract calls for annual evaluation, and so they are developing this evaluation tool. He will not be evaluated for the first time until January of 2024, because the idea is this will be something they do every January. They don't want to do it this January because he'll only have been there for half the year. So he's going to have a little bit of lead time, but they're going to talk some more about that and approve that process and that mechanism at their meeting. And then City Council is meeting on Tuesday.
City Council's meeting on Tuesday. They got a couple of big things coming up. The one thing is they're going to be authorizing the mayor to apply for, actually KCDC to apply for a $55 million grant from the Infrastructure Act that would is designed to put in infrastructure to in areas that were affected by urban renewal. And this would they're going to be using this to make better connections and throughout the area just east of downtown, where the Civic Coliseum and Auditorium are, and other, a lot of residences there. But to make better connections, especially on foot, especially ways to get across the chasm that is James White Parkway right there. So the grant requires a $25 million local match, which sounds like a lot, but the city has already planned and budgeted for several of the projects that could be used for this grant, so they think that'll be a way to do that. It also is in line with the goals of the African American Equity Restoration Task Force, which their goal is to have $100 million in grant-funded projects that would benefit the areas that were affected by urban renewal, and East Knoxville in particular.
So this could make up more than half of that.
It would make up more than half of that if assuming that they get to count it toward that.
Right.
They can probably do that because there's no.
I think they can count
anything
anything toward that they want to, since
Yes.
they created the task force. Right?
Yes, but they have endorsed the process. Another item that will be up is something we've talked about before: the sculpture that's going into Cradle of Country Music Park, and the now one tree that will have to be removed to accommodate it. The contract for the base of the sculpture, which was what was going to knock out trees before, that contract is going to come forward. It's going to be an $824,000 contract with Blunt Construction, so Blunt Contractors, excuse me, and they're going to be voting on it since the compromise was reached a couple of weeks ago on the tree removal.
Saving most of the trees.
Saving 4 of the 5 trees that had been slated for removal. I think that this will probably go through, although it's a little steeper than I think they initially had intended. There's also going to be, speaking of things that are steeper than intended, going to be a $7.5 million increase to the city budget this year that they're going to have to approve. $5 million of that goes to the facade work at the public safety complex that we've already talked about it and written about it. But then there's some various other things like the tree canopy master plan to help make Knoxville greener, and then various road projects and other items that will make up that.
And will those funds come from fund balance?
They're coming from fund balance. They've got the money, but they'll but it just wasn't designated for those.
When we say fund balance, we basically mean
savings account,
the rainy day fund, or whatever you want to call it, but it's unbudgeted money that the city has.
Yeah, and so it's one of those. It's an account that basically gives them a cushion where if things do come up, like the facade problems at the public safety complex, they
have money to pay.
Money to pay for it. Yeah. So and then. On Thursday, the Planning Commission is going to be meeting.
Right, a week earlier than usual, which I think they moved up because of fall break.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they moved it up because of fall break. I'm sure that probably played into it, but it always meets the second week of the month, and the 1st of October is on Saturday, so technically...
They meet the second Thursday of the month.
So
this is the first Thursday.
Yeah, it will be the first Thursday, so... Yeah. Anyway, one of the interesting things that they have going on there is a proposal to rezone property for an outdoor paintball field. Woods there too, though. It's like I said, they don't use the word park, but I'm guessing that's kind of the most accurate way of saying this. But it's a paintball area,
like a paintball combat
zone in Hardin Valley, up near the river in Hardin Valley. So that's going to be one of the interesting things on their agenda. There's also a couple of residential projects in South Knoxville, around one of them on, one of them near Governor John Sevier Highway, which has seen a lot of development activity in recent months. Yep. And there's also going to be a proposal come forward on a mixed-use development on the South Waterfront, not right on the waterfront. This is just back off the waterfront. Part of the land is actually owned by the city, so but it's on Hillwood. If people are familiar with that, that's a very narrow road that is actually getting widened and being improved. But it's yet another development associated with the waterfront and the improvements that have been made down there.
Yeah, well, and that connects that little stretch of Hillwood that connects from what is it down there? It's Island Home
Avenue
up to kind of where you come off of James White Parkway there has been anybody who lives in South Knoxville or just goes to IAMS Nature Center a lot or whatever is very familiar with it because it has these very steep drainage ditches on either side.
Right.
It's a very narrow road, so it always kind of feels like you're about to go off the road. So I guess if this project is giving them, I know when I worked at the city, there was talk about improving it, but it'd be pretty expensive. And so you need a sizable project probably to give kind of the sufficient incentive and reason to actually spend the money to make those improvements.
Right, and the access point will probably be up because this property slopes considerably, but it'd probably be up on the high ground of the property, which is closer to James White Parkway. So
and the road is already a bit wider.
It's already wider there. The real narrow part of it is down toward Island Home Avenue, and there's not, I'm sure that the thinking is that most of the access and traffic will go from that site out to James White Parkway or down Sevier Avenue instead of down the narrow Hillwood.
Right. Gotcha.
Yep.
Okay, well, we will be back next week to talk about all of those things. And in the meantime, we hope you all have a good week.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.